Welcome to the You Are a Force podcast channel, your go-to space for real stories, fearless dreams, and unstoppable women rewriting the rules. And the force behind this podcast. Here is your host, Binoli Botadara.
Hi everyone, welcome to You Are a Force, a podcast where we celebrate women who just don't think boldly, but they reshape the way we actually think or the world thinks about women. I'm your host Binoli Botadara, and today I have someone very, very special, someone whose work has actually been into 3 decades of work, but also 3 pounds of grey matter, which actually influence every decision we take today, our emotions, our ambitions, everything. So she has actually been someone who has been a leading neuroscientist in the world. She has actually had master's degree and PhD in neuroscience from the University of Oxford. She is the author of a groundbreaking 3 books which includes women's brain. So the women's brain book, baby brain, and demystifying the female brain. But these books actually challenge the way we think about women's brain. They challenge the basics of the science and the biases science have, and they also challenge you to dismantle the assumptions we have. So because her work actually signifies women's brains, why they were understudied, why they were misinterpreted, and why there is a generations of gap in terms of what we know and what we should know. So, but the most important thing for me is that her work is not just exceptional because of her research, but her ability to translate this insane data into a very normal, practical, powerful thing which women can understand at every stage of life. So I cannot wait to actually pick someone's brain who dedicates her life in ensuring that we understand our brains much better intellectually and unapologetically. So without a further ado, please welcome. It's my absolute honor to have Dr. Sarah McKay. Sarah, thank you so much for being on You Are a Force.
Oh, I'm glad we can finally get the opportunity to chat.
I know I have been waiting. I have been stalking you since many, many years. I have been listening to your interviews, your podcast, and I once stumbled upon, your one of the reels which I saw actually on Instagram, and I was like, what you said something which actually stuck with me, and I was like, who is this lady? And that's when I started doing some research on. And when I started my podcast, you were one of the top 10 people I wanted to interview.
Oh, wow. Thank
And
you.
it's been, I don't know, 7, 8 months. And finally, I'm here. So this is actually my dream come true. So thank you
Oh,
for making
gosh.
that happen.
Well, I hope I live up to the expectations.
Oh, you gotta supersede it. So, Sarah, I want to start with your journey, but I want to start from the very beginning. And before the Dr. Sarah McKay we all know, how was it like growing up in New Zealand as a child? And did you ever think that you want to become, or did you ever dream of becoming a scientist, or you had like some bizarre dreams to become? How did it turn out the way
Mm.
it did?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up a very long way away from where I am. Well, not literally now. I live in Sydney now, but I grew up in Christchurch in New Zealand in a very humble, but very, very loving, supportive, warm family. My mum and dad both left school when they were 15. And before I went away to university, I'd never met anyone who went to university before except my GP and my dentist, who
Really?
happened to be married to each other. So I had no kind of inherited map of an academic life or an intellectual life or what a scientist was. I mean, this was, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so it was not anything that occurred to me, but I did love books and I loved going, I'd go off to the library every Friday afternoon and bring home a massive pile of books and devour them. And I read all of the books that, girls did in the 80s, the Judy Blooms and Flowers in the Attic and all of that sort of thing. I loved reading and I loved learning and I loved school, but I didn't have any sense of any kind of academic world or life because I hadn't really seen a lot of the world.
Sure.
But I was always given warmth and love and support. And So I headed off to university. Me and my best friend there weren't that many girls from my school who ended up going to university, but we both did. She's a psychiatrist now. And in my first year, I was at Canterbury University and I was in a Psychology 101 lecture. I did lots of subjects in my first year. I did English, I did psychology, I did chemistry, I did American studies, I did biology. And
Yeah.
Psychology 101 lecture, we were told it was a segment on the biology of psychology. And I thought, this is amazing. And we were learning about synapses between neurons, and I'd never heard of them before. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And then we were told to read a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, who writes these amazing case studies, partly fiction, partly fact, about the things that go wrong with people's thoughts and feelings and behaviors when things go wrong with their brains. And I was captivated by this idea of neurology. And so I changed universities because I knew there was a new degree discipline at Otago University that had just been set up that year to do a degree in neuroscience. And so I graduated as part of the first cohort in New Zealand back in 1996 with a degree in neuroscience. So it was kind of very much just kind of following the vibes.
Mm.
I didn't really have any great strategic plan or dream of what I was going to do or be. And then I headed off to Europe backpacking with friends with a couple of thousand Kiwi dollars in a tent in the
Ah.
summer of 1997. Ended up in Edinburgh. When I was in Edinburgh, I was working in a pub. I spent a lot of time in pubs drinking and working. And when I wasn't doing that, I used to go to the Edinburgh University Library and just read through the classifieds of Nature and Science magazine. And then I saw a 4-year PhD program funded by the Wellcome Trust at Oxford that was advertised, and I thought, oh, that sounds like me. Again, it never even crossed my mind to go to a university like that. I just saw the advert and thought, wow, that sounds cool. And so I went and interviewed. Had no idea who was on the interview panel. I had no idea that you should have found those things. I just didn't. I just went in blind, quite naive. Maybe that's how you are in your 20s. I don't know, or how we were in the 90s. And but I knew I had a really good story from my honours research project about synapses and about brain development, and I knew I had a good story and I liked telling that story. And so I nailed the interview and I ended up in Oxford. So it was kind of a series of just kind of, you know, spotting something that I thought sounded quite interesting and just following that path, but without a lot of strategy behind it.
I love that because it was A meant to be, but also you followed what your gut was directing you towards, right? You
Yeah, yeah. I just had some really strong intuitions that I should just have a that I just I did have very strong, and it's interesting because I think as a neuroscientist or as a scientist and academic, your intuition, you get told not to trust that. And I do
yes.
think, and knowing about the neurobiology of intuition now, I do believe that the more you know a topic, perhaps, and that might be yourself, the more your intuition is correct. When you're a novice at something, you don't know what you're on about. Your intuition isn't necessarily correct. I just happened to make
Hmm.
some lucky choices along the way. So I'm very glad that I did. But there was no strategy at the beginning whatsoever. No
Love
imposter syndrome either, because that hadn't been invented then. I just went with it and had a go.
that. So, you basically did, I mean, the University of Oxford is one of the best in the world. So,
Mm.
and you did a postdoctorate into spinal cord injury as well, I think.
Yeah, that was after I'd done my 4 years in Oxford. Me and my now husband moved to Sydney
Yeah.
on a bit of a whim. Again, we thought, "Oh, Sydney, that'd be a fun place to live. Let's go live there." And he got transferred for work, so it's quite easy in 2002. And I was casting around looking for postdoc opportunities, and one came up in spinal cord injury, which I was really interested in because my PhD research topic had been quite theoretical, looking at kind of the nature and nurture of kind of the first synaptic connections in the brain, and it didn't feel very applied, whereas spinal cord injury research
Mm.
felt very, very applied. So I moved into and did that for a few years. But I think having a Wellcome Trust funded scholarship and being at Oxford kind of ruins you for
It does.
anything. and it, there's funding was a lot harder to come by here in Australia, and it was just a different sort of space. And I really enjoyed the bench research and I enjoyed the academic questions, but it was very hard to do good science here. And I started to feel very much drawn away from academic, even though I loved academia, it's also a really hard place to be. Um, and it felt like you could work very, very hard on something, and it being biology, you didn't necessarily get anywhere, even though you were working very, very hard to solve a problem. The
Mm.
pH of a solution 2 weeks ago could have been out by point 0.1, and that ruined everything. And probably, I was talking to a friend who's a farmer recently, and I said it's very much like farming, a tiny little thing can turn and it can ruin a crop. And that's what science felt sometimes like. And without that kind of Oxford life wrapped around you, it was a very hard place to be. And I
Mm.
felt very drawn to, and what I was enjoying more than anything was telling the stories and sharing the stories about science. I'd always loved that part, having a just good chat and a conversation with
Mm.
someone. So the conversations and the love of the science came together, and I decided to jump out of academia, which was not an easy decision. It was a very long, it's a hard one decision to make, but to move into a career in science communication,
Mm.
which felt like for many years a bit of a failed scientist move. Um, but
Why?
here we
Because
are.
it's not very common, or
Well,
people have
I think
done.
that there was perhaps less so, but in some places still, there's a very strong prevailing view in academia that if you leave, you're selling your soul or you've failed as a scientist.
Mm.
Um, And who wants to do either of those things? Especially when
True.
you've embedded, when a lot of your identity is embedded in an academic life and being a
Mm.
scientist. And it's very, very hard. And especially here in Australia right now, the funding sort of situation is so, so terribly hard. Um, but you've got the pushes and the pulls and the stories about what it means to leave academia. I didn't know that I could still be a scientist. And this was back in 2006. So
Mm.
again, there wasn't a lot of social media, there wasn't a lot of internet life.
Mm.
The digital world didn't really exist, so you couldn't necessarily see what else was out there to do. You
Yeah.
couldn't think, oh, I could become a TikTok scientist, or, I can just build a science communications career using Instagram Reels or LinkedIn. That didn't exist as an
No, I
option.
agree. Yeah.
So again, it felt very everything. There was a lot of gatekeepers and a lot of other people making decisions and you kind of had to sort of fit in along that path.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, at the same time that I decided to leave academia, I also got pregnant with my oldest son. So motherhood was this amazing option as well. And I wanted to kind of explore that and put myself into that. And I'm quite happy to set aside, drop, as my mother says, there's some balls you can put down rather than drop when you're trying to juggle the balls of life. And I just decided, oh, well, I'll just put the career bit down for a while and do the motherhood thing for a bit.
Mm. No, amazing, amazing. I'm very glad you did because that gave us so much of awareness and, recognition in terms of what your work has been. Otherwise, we might not have seen this side of the world as well. So, Sarah, your work is pivotal because it challenges the historic male as a default model, right? What for decades and decades, women were excluded from the clinical trials. Even till I think about 1993, women were not
Mm,
included in the trials, and also majority of the neuroscience experiments also are conducted on male animals to avoid
mm,
hormonal fluctuations. However, you have, or your work has actually shown that the brain of a boy and a girl are pretty much similar at the time of birth, right? So meaning is basically every difference happen over the change of time. So what was that one moment where you realized that there is a huge gap and this is what you really want to address and do
mm,
research? Because
mm.
what was that trigger?
Yeah, so there's probably three. I just want to comment on a couple of those points. The idea that historically there wasn't the same inclusion of women in medical research and our understanding of human biology and physiology and neuroscience and healthcare is based on the male model. And and that's a very easy thing to say, but and women were excluded from some kinds of clinical trials for many years, and some of that was partly for good reason because of the thalidomide scandal and scare, and so that was seen as an exclusion because for a well-meaning intention. Women have been included since the 90s, so it's not like it was last year that we sort of
Mm.
started waking up to this. Women have been included. It's just we haven't necessarily always studied female biology in the same way that we've studied human biology. So, and sometimes it wasn't necessarily this kind of let's exclude women decision. It was often an oversight or well-meaning or let's remove some variables from the data. So the reasons as to why we ended up with gaps in women's health research is actually quite complex. It's not pernicious necessarily. And that is rapidly changing. And as you say, since the early 90s, women have been included. So, we do have a long history of good data. It's kind of become a bit popularist to say there's a gap, and that but we're getting there. We're slowly getting there. The second is around the idea of a male brain versus a female brain. And I don't think it's quite accurate to say that male and female brains and most of our biology is identical from birth, and any differences that emerge after that are solely about experience, because there are differences that emerge in utero with some of the early neurobiological patterning that takes place very early in development, whereby baby males are exposed to testosterone from their own testes in the womb. And that kind of sets up kind of a male biology pattern that's then activated later on in puberty. And females aren't exposed to testosterone. They're not exposed to estrogen either from themselves or from their mothers.
Mhm.
And that absence of testosterone sets up a female biology pattern, which is then activated by hormones at puberty. Males and females are born with, and the thing is, we thought that there were no differences because we were often limited by how we could study a brain. You
Mm.
can't necessarily pop a newborn baby in an MRI scanner or an fMRI scanner and look at circuit development. And it's only been in recent times when we've really started to get enough data and data sharing and biobanks and collaborations and consortiums where there's enough power in numbers and
Mhm.
machine learning and AI that's able to analyze the good sets of data. So we're now sort of starting to tell a clearer story about sex as a biological variable. So we've got sex as a biological variable, but then experiences of being a male and a female in the world
Mhm.
and how they influence and shape the brain. So the stories are I just wanted to add some nuance there. How did I end up kind of working in this space? Because, I'd always been a neuroscience and science communicator. That came about in about 2015 here in Australia. I was writing for the ABC at the time, our ABC, like the BBC in the UK.
Mhm.
And they had like kind of this brain blog that I would write every week. And like kind of a story about anything that you can imagine about the brain and brain health and habits, motivation, I don't know, thoughts,
Mm.
depression, you name it. And one week I wrote an article on menopause and brain fog, which is quite a new idea back then. It
Mhm.
was not a topic that was talked about very much. And the article went absolutely gangbusters. And I was then approached a little while later by a book publisher saying, do you want to write a book? And I was like, no, I once wrote a PhD thesis, haven't recovered, have no. And I knew if you were to write a book, you needed a really good idea. And I
Yeah.
didn't feel like I'd encapsulated an idea. So I met with the publisher and they said, well, what have you written for an audience that they loved? And I said, oh, there's this article on menopause and brain fog. And she said, why don't you write a book on that? And I was like, oh, I'm 40. Like, I'm not going to write about menopause. I said, there's not really a lot of neurobiology in that
Sure.
space. And then she said, oh, what about the idea of baby brain where women, lose their brains or minds when they become pregnant and mothers? And I was like, I just think that that's just ridiculous. I don't think there's any neuroscience to support that idea. But then I thought, well, we've got pregnancy, we've got menopause, we've got puberty, we've got girls and women have higher rates of anxiety and depression. We know that women are more likely to be diagnosed with dementia than men. We've got all of these sorts of sex differences through the lifespan. I could write a book, a womb to tomb tour of the female brain. looking at reproductive life transitions
Mhm.
through the lens of neurobiology. And I thought there's so many questions I don't know the answers to. What happens on when we're on the pill? What happens to an anxious brain? Is that different if you're male or female? What happens to the brain during pregnancy? What happens to the brain when you're breastfeeding? I kind of knew a little bit about some of these ideas, but not a lot.
Mm.
And the book publishers just snapped that idea up straight away, and that was the Woman's Brain book, which I did a second edition of in the last one a year ago, because from 2017 to now, there's just been so much new research. It was published in the UK under the title Demystifying the Female Brain. A few
Okay.
years later, then I wanted to write specifically about pregnancy and motherhood, and again, this idea of baby brain. Um, this idea that motherhood and pregnancy sculpt our brains and change our minds for the better, not for the
Mhm.
worse.
Mhm.
There's this trope that the female brain is dysfunctional and broken, and it's not. And then I wrote Brain Health for Dummies as well in the For Dummies series. So that was kind of really weird. Like it was really just this conversation again, a conversation about neuroscience where that the book ideas came from.
Mm.
And when you write a book about the lifespan, there's always someone that's going to resonate with it. So there's always a lot of conversations. Someone has a baby, someone is a teenager, someone's a new mum,
Yeah.
someone's got a parent with dementia, someone's in midlife going through menopause. There's so many conversations that you can have,
Mm.
which has just been great fun.
Which is amazing because I also wanted to double down on so many these aspects which you talked about, from puberty to what happens to the brain when you sleep and all sorts of things, but something very, very close to my heart because I know some people who go through Alzheimer's, and therefore I really want to pick your brain because you have done enough research on this too, that women are twice likely as men compared
Yeah,
to men to develop
yeah.
Alzheimer's. So, from your perspective and research, why do you think that disparity exists, A, to begin with? And you also mention about brain fog, right? So, what is the brain fog? And if you can give us like two most powerful, science-based maybe hacks if we can do as women to actually reduce the risk
Yeah.
of getting into this disease.
Yeah, so there's lots of things that you've just said there, so we're going to have to kind of address them all one by one because there's kind of a lot of topics there. So I'm going to do the Alzheimer's disease dementia question first, then talk about brain fog, and then talk about brain health
Sure.
ideas because there's a lot of ground to cover. I think when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia statistics, we need to kind of think about, what do these words mean? So we've got dementia as an umbrella term, which really describes the sort of the symptoms that you experience
Mm.
or people experience when they've got various different types of diseases of typically of aging. And Alzheimer's disease is the main kind of type of dementia. And that we often hear this idea women are at greater risk of developing dementia than men or Alzheimer's disease than men, twice, three times. You hear all these numbers, and I think
Yeah.
it's really important to interrogate that because what does that actually mean? And the usual, you know, we need to kind of understand the difference between what we call prevalence, which is the total number of people living with, say, Alzheimer's disease,
Sure.
and also look at the incidence, which is the rate of new cases. Because when we look at these, it tells a bit more of an interesting story. Because the usual explanation is that women on average live longer than men, which we know happens globally. It's actually a
Yeah.
female biology phenomenon. Females of any species live longer than males of the species.
Mm-hmm.
There's more women alive who could then be living with Alzheimer's disease or have developed Alzheimer's disease in those few years.
Mm-hmm.
And another possibility is that the men who reach extremely old age have got there because they haven't had heart disease,
Mm.
which killed them off younger, which also lowers your risk. So we need to kind of look at prevalence, and I think about that as the pool of people alive, and incidence is like the inflow or the tap. And so we know that there's more women alive with Alzheimer's disease than men because in some instances there's a little bit more of an inflow, but that really only happens once you kind of hit your mid 80s or 90s.
Mm-hmm.
More men are dying, so they're flowing out of the plug hole, and that means there's more women
Sure.
in there. But the
Yeah.
incidence is really important to look at because that inflow or incidence depends it varies across generations. So people born in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s have very different lives than people who were born in the 1950s and 60s and 70s.
Sure.
And we look in different countries in the world, and countries where there's greater gender equality and they're much healthier, wealthier nations, the inflow of males and females is very, very similar up until much later ages. And that's probably because
Sure.
of like the lives you lived when you were younger.
Yeah.
In countries where, in low and middle income countries where there's greater gender inequality, the inflow of females is much greater.
Mm,
So than it is for males, and that can be accounted for everything going all the way back to early life education,
yeah.
access to enriched opportunities, the kinds of lives you've lived. So it's not this kind of global statistic where women get Alzheimer's and men don't. We really need to understand, and it is so boring to kind of understand and think about statistics and prevalence and incidence and
Yeah.
mortality.
Yeah.
Because some studies find no sex differences, the inflow at any age. Others say it only emerges after the age 90 or for people born in the 1920s.
Mm,
So
mm,
we need to kind of understand that. And when we understand that, then that opens up the idea, oh, it's not just female
yeah.
biology. It's not just women living longer than men. It's not just hormones. It's how lives are lived. It comes down to cardiovascular health, rates of smoking, rates of alcohol, access to education, a lot of sexed and gendered experiences
Mhm.
that we have. And that's why I think we need to kind of take a global view,
Sure.
like look at the planet and look at dementia through a socioeconomic lens, a public health lens, not just a what
Just
hormones have
number.
shifted lens, which is
Yeah.
kind of the default way. So that's that kind of idea. And when we look at it like that, we can start looking at what do we know about risk factors. And risk is very much like what's going to tip things in your favor or not. And
Mm,
we know about 40% of cases of dementia can be prevented by way that we can, there's like, we can intervene, we can reduce risk. Some of these we can do a lot about as an individual depending on your resources, take care of your cardiovascular health, take care of your metabolic health, do exercise, find ways to reduce your stress. Some things it's a bit harder to do, access to education, particularly in, the first couple of decades of life. If you're 60, you can't do anything about how long you stayed at primary school. Air pollution is an enormous risk factor, but we can't all, as
right.
individuals, do much about air pollution. We could perhaps not cook with gas and cook with an induction, but that decision is very much limited by your socioeconomic kind of capabilities. One of the greatest risk
Why,
factors is
sorry,
hearing loss. Sorry?
why does air pollution impact this?
Because air pollution is terrible for our overall physical health and physiological health and
Yeah.
metabolic health. So in parts of the world where there's more air pollution, rates of dementia and Alzheimer's disease are higher
Oh, okay.
because of the particles in the air.
And you
It's just
inhale that.
literally like a toxin in the air, which makes its way in and increases your risk of dementia. And now that's a modifiable risk factor, but it's not a risk. It's not like an individual might necessarily have the same agency over doing anything
Yeah.
about that
Yeah.
than they might about perhaps taking care of their own individual cardiovascular health.
Right.
So there's a lot of those ideas in there. One of the strongest risk factors that we know is the most where we can intervene is midlife hearing loss. But again, being able to intervene depends on access to healthcare, right? So we know that hearing loss is as a oh gosh, what's the statistic? I don't know whether it's sort of 7 or 8% of cases globally could be kind of eliminated if we
Okay.
treated hearing loss at midlife. And why does treating hearing loss at midlife kind of help? So giving someone hearing aids, it means that, their brain is still receiving that sensory input. They're able to engage socially. They're still out there in the world and they
Mm,
haven't got that kind of cognitive demand and kind of fatigue that comes from trying to make your way through the world without being able to hear.
okay.
So that's an incredibly important risk factor to be able to address. So
Sure.
if we were to kind of look at what we can all do,
Yeah.
there are these published modifiable risk factors. And if we were to kind of take a look at, say, midlife, Well, that would be ensure as much education and opportunities for children and young people as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and try and avoid head injuries, and
Yeah.
then treat hearing loss, treat depression, um, treat metabolic health issues, treat cardiovascular health issues. Do whatever you can to lead the most sort of healthy, physically robust, socially engaged, intellectually engaged life that you can.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you reach later life, deal with the loneliness, try and keep people socially engaged, make sure they can kind of interact with their world around them. And the third kind of thing here that you asked about and your question was this idea of brain fog.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And brain fog is quite a colloquial term, and we could use that. People might talk about, they're going through an incredibly stressful experience. They're a natural disaster. You might have brain fog. You might have, excuse me, people with, say, ADHD might talk about brain fog. People who haven't had a lot of sleep might talk about brain fog. New
Mm-hmm.
mothers going through pregnancy and early motherhood, there's a lot of stress. You've given
Mm-hmm.
birth, you're trying to look after a new baby. It's really hard to pay attention to anything except the baby. You might call that baby brain or brain fog,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't feel like your brain functions as well as it used to. Women going through perimenopause and menopause often talk about brain fog, the idea that you can't quite grab the words that you used to, or your brain isn't kind of spinning as easily as it used to, and the cogs aren't quite turning, and everything kind of feels fuzzy, and you're forgetting words. So the brain fog is a bit of a fuzzy, foggy phrase.
Mm.
Um, and what's causing that? Well, it depends on who you are and what you are using that term to describe what your experience might
Sure.
be.
Sure.
For midlife women, where it's typically most talked about right now in the algorithms, um, is around perimenopause and menopause. So what's changing then to give a lot of women this experience of fogginess and forgetfulness? Well, hormones are obviously roller coastering and then flatlining. And so what is it about them? Is it the disruption, the kind of the knock-on effects of thermoregulation and then sleep?
Mm-hmm.
One night's sleep, you feel a bit foggy, weeks, months, years, you're inevitably going to feel foggy. Is it an increased risk of anxiety and depression, which can come about via changes to our autonomic nervous system physiology, and waking a lot at night that's causing depression and anxiety, and brain fog can go hand in hand with that? Is it to do with changes in brain metabolism, kind of energetics, which come about by how hormones change, how efficiently our neurons um, you know, create energy and metabolize, and there's some kind of metabolic shift, which means the brain isn't kind of running as efficiently as possible? Is it that kind of midlife collision whereby you're looking after children and teenagers and your own physical health and your partner, and then you've got aging parents? Is it trying to perform at that peak the same way that you used to when your brain is reorganizing as it does in midlife, versus the quick sharp thinking of our 20s, and then contrasting ourselves to that, and
Mm.
not realizing, well, actually I can slow down and be more wise and thoughtful and become a matriarch, versus having to be quick and sharp and thinking and building and da, 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 da. So there's
Mm.
a lot of things going on. It's hard to know what's the chicken and egg or what's the first domino to fall. It's
Sure.
a complex web.
Sure. No, it's very important. And what I really picked was how important sleeping is, or deep sleep is, maybe for 8 hours or six
Yeah.
hours. And I have a confession to make that I am a horrible, horrible person when it comes to sleeping. I can be up all night, do not sleep like most of the nights properly. Weekends, I'm like
Gosh.
most of the
Is
night.
that because you can't or you don't want to?
No, I don't want to.
Oh,
I
gosh.
mean, I
I'm the
love.
opposite. I love sleep more than anything. It's my favorite
No,
thing.
it is my favorite thing, but I do not sleep at night most of the times because I'm reading, I'm watching. I love the silence of the night, which ultimately is not, as my mom would say, that the night sleep is a night sleep, which cannot be replaced with the day sleep.
Yeah, your mum's
Because
right.
and I mean, and I'm not super proud of it. And of course, the weekdays because I have to go to work and everything, so I don't behave so bad. But all I could hear was, how important it is, which was the underlying tone. So, and I believe that since you said that, I think there are some sort of toxins which might be, released by brain or something. So Why sleep is so important, one, I really want to ask.
Yeah.
And also, what happens when we dream? Because I always wonder that brain is still functioning when we're sleeping.
Yeah, I don't know the answer about why do we dream and what's happening. It's a bit more of a mystery to me, and neuroscience is trying to figure that out. So I can't answer that question. When we sleep, I mean, our brain doesn't release toxins when we sleep. I think that's just an important kind of idea to just to deal with straight away. We obviously fundamentally biologically need to sleep. Every cell in our body has a 24-hour kind of biological clock that's entrained by the rising and the setting of the sun, and every organism on the planet, well, particularly, every organism on the planet has that 24-hour rhythm.
Okay.
Um, and we know what happens when we don't sleep for one night, for weeks, for months, for years. And the risks to our overall health, our metabolic health, our cognitive health, our brain health, our risk for disease, mortality,
Hmm.
is intimately entwined with the idea of not just how much we sleep at night, but the regularity of that rhythm, the
Yeah.
regularity of a bedtime, the regularity of a wake time. And we've known that for many years, but we're now starting to get the hard data to support that, particularly because there's so much data that's being able to be gathered from wearables, etc.
Yeah.
So it's it's fundamentally and part of our of every cell in our body, every organism that lives on this planet because of the Earth spinning on its axis and the rising and the setting of the sun.
Mm.
One, and there's many reasons why we sleep, in part because our body uses it as a chance to kind of repair and regulate itself. Our brain does a number of different activities while we're asleep. It doesn't kind of shut down. It
Mhm.
becomes reasonably active, whereby it kind of starts to process what we've learned during the day, the experiences of the day, and this some of these kind of get repeated and turned over in our mind and then consolidated as memories. So
Mhm.
we know if you sleep the night after you've experienced something, then that's part of that consolidation and memory formation process. We understand how that happens at the level of the synapse through to the level of a person. Interestingly, there's also evidence that, if you stay awake after a particular event, and this is sometimes used if people can intervene at the right time in terms of, you've had a car accident or some kind of trauma,
Mm.
staying awake the night after that
Yeah.
event happens can reduce the consolidation of that as a traumatic memory, which
Oh.
I used a number of years ago now when I was in a car accident. It wasn't a particularly severe one, but I sort of stayed awake and that night because I thought, oh, I don't want to be nervous about that.
Mm.
Um, we also know that although it's kind of a little bit debated, the exact ideas of this mechanism, because there's some research that's come out saying this is what happens, other research saying countering it, and this is what happens in science. That when we are asleep, the lymphatic system, or like the brain's lymphatic system, flushes out and kind of releases a lot of the detritus, and I mean we could say toxins. I don't like using that word, but the
Mm.
kind of metabolites that the brain has produced when we are awake get flushed out of the brain when we are asleep. And there's greater rates of lymphatic clearance when we're asleep when we're awake. But recently, papers have come in saying actually it's more when you're awake than when you're asleep, and there's a bit of scientific chit chat about that, which I think is quite interesting.
Mhm.
We know that people, like if we look kind of project long term, people who have poor sleep and aren't sleeping regularly at night have greater risks of dementia and overall poorer health and poorer mental health, etc.
Mhm.
So I suppose it's that risk benefit of weighing up the quiet time versus, the biological mandate to sleep.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I'm going to take this seriously now from tonight onwards. And
Mhm.
I also something very personal I wanted to ask. Like, I'm a hyper focused person. I cannot multitask. If I'm talking to you, I can't hear what the other person is speaking. If I'm on the phone, I just cannot do it. And a lot of my friends who claim to be a multitasker, they usually tell me, I mean, they're very proud and, like they're very honored to be multitasker, but the neuroscience says that it's a myth, right? Like 40% of your productivity reduces when you do multitasking or multiple things. So
Mm,
what is that actual neurological cost of a chronic constant switching between the task which human beings do by the name
yeah.
of by the name of multitasking, and Do you
Yeah.
think it's healthy to be a multitasker, or how do you see, from your point of view, how people should take this particular uh, multitasking as a challenge, or they should actually double down on that?
Mm. I mean, I guess you've kind of summed it up, really. The idea is that, we've got kind of attention, and I often think about attention instead of having to think about, what is happening inside the brain. Think about the attention as being kind of like a flashlight, one of those torches where you can turn it and it can be broad, diffuse, or narrow and focused. And you're in a dark room and you can really only shine your attention in one direction
Mm,
at a time. It can be taking in what's, kind of happening out the window of the world, or can be very, very focused and narrow and perhaps reading, a book or whatever.
mm,
And typically the vast majority of people can't kind of haven't got like two flashlights. Essentially what you're doing when you are so-called multitasking is essentially that you are kind of moving your flashlight from one thing to another, one thing to
mm,
another, and you can't kind of complete the task. That task switching kind of reduces your performance on both of those individual tasks. um, there's various ways we can measure this and metrics out there. And it's also kind of increases your stress levels as well. So your overall efficiency drops. In the vast majority of people, some people who are particularly adept and able to do that. Like air traffic controllers, perhaps, or surgeons, or chefs running a kitchen with a lot of things going on.
mm,
So there are some kind of people who gravitate towards those professions where they are able to retain the efficiency while they kind of move their flashlight and focus that on lots of different kinds of places at once. So we've got brain imaging data kind of looking at people while they are kind of paying attention to one thing, like unitasking or
mhm,
monotasking versus multitasking. And we can literally see that, the parts of the brain involved with paying attention become more activated when you're focusing on a task. But when you're switching between two tasks, we kind of see one hemisphere focuses on one task, the other hemisphere focuses on the other. Add in a third task, you haven't kind of got a third
mm,
hemisphere. So we
mm,
are kind of like biologically limited by how much we can switch our attention around. And so I
mm,
like to use the analogy of like a torch or a flashlight
mm,
to help people kind of think about this. And you can test people on this. It's quite fun to do in a group, if or like a school, or get some boys up. They always like this, and time them to recite the alphabet or say the alphabet backwards and count to 25, 1 to 25, and then get them to kind of multitask, whereby they have to go something like Z1, X, Y, Y2,
uh-huh,
X3. So they're
yeah,
multitasking. So they're doing the alphabet and counting. And they have to
uh-huh.
kind of task switch, and the speed goes down and the stress goes up, and everyone else around them has a good laugh.
Love that.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a sort of silly bit of fun to kind of demonstrate multitasking. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, like, if that's what you insist on doing, do it. I don't know whether it's a badge of honor. And I think basically the point we're at these days is everyone has one of these things in their hand, and we're kind of cradling them around in our arms like they're a little baby, and our attention is completely consumed by that. And people everywhere are talking about their reduced ability to pay attention. And surveys have been done looking at different people of different ages, and even people in 18, 19, 20, 21-year olds who are kind of at their cognitive peak for many capabilities are reporting reduced ability to pay attention. And that's because your attention, you're constantly multitasking, your attention is constantly going towards this phone. You
Mm,
can't focus on one kind of thing at a time. So um, we need to sort of start thinking about where our attention's kind of flowing.
mm, mm. No, absolutely, absolutely. And Sarah, also, the beauty of the brain is because it's so, so beautiful, but you can still constantly update, change, with a lot of other things which we do. I mean, constantly, in very famously in your book, you've said that you don't have to die with the brain you were born. You can still change it. So I want to know that we live with the very stereotypical gender diverse sort of mindset, where there are so many perceptions about you are hardwired into your brain or in others' brains. So if someone is actually who is listening today is stuck into that sort of negative loop, or perhaps has an imposter syndrome or a lack of self-belief, or maybe dealing with trauma. From the neuroplasticity point of view, is there any hack or any recommendation you have to break that pattern so that you
Mm.
can actually go towards the pathway of recovery?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of changing a brain and changing a mind, there's a massive kind of range of things there. Imposter syndrome is something very different from, say, childhood trauma or, you know, being sexually assaulted or being
Mm,
in a natural disaster and, you know, just kind of starting to think in a different way about trauma is very different to educating yourself about why you might feel like you don't belong in a certain space when you completely belong. So I think we need to be careful of and how we're talking about different experiences people have and how they've arrived at the place they're at and what it is that they want to do next and change. And if we set something like trauma aside, because that's a bit of a different kind of thing, you could be dealing with someone with PTSD or anxiety or depression or whatever, just
right.
something like imposter syndrome, which I've never personally experienced, but it wasn't invented when I was young. So didn't experience it because wasn't a thing, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think, and I don't mean that in a trite way, I more mean that in a sometimes we have an experience because we've been told it's a thing.
Yeah,
Like I never had baby brain either, but I'd never, when I had my boys, but I'd never heard of baby brain.
yeah.
You know, I knew what was going on with me, but I wasn't going, oh, me and my dumb little mum brain, because I'd never been told it was a thing to
It
expect or to
was, yeah. There was
experience.
a name to it.
And we're bombarded with social media algorithms telling us about what we should be expecting, and expectation is an enormous part of any kind of outcome and any kind of health outcome. I always think, and this is to kind of paraphrase, one of my colleagues, Dr. Mary Collins, who's a psychologist and does a lot of work in coaching psychology, says, awareness is the first step, and kind of understanding what is this kind of idea that is holding you back. You have something like imposter syndrome, which I say I'm not a particular fan of because I think it's a made up phenomenon just to describe a sensation that you have of not kind of fitting in, which
Mm-hmm.
is a lot of the time not a real, it's not real. It's you've started thinking it. What is that? What is that coming from? Is it like kind of a long held belief you've had about your place in the world? Is it you've gone into something where you don't know people yet, you haven't made social connections, you just kind of haven't found your feet? Is it due to some kind of underpinning anxiety whereby you're feeling kind of hypervigilant, you're kind of underslept, you haven't ate, you haven't you know
Mm-hmm.
taken care of your physiology? Is it due to like some kind of hierarchical structure that you don't necessarily understand or know how to navigate? Often change isn't necessarily always just about thinking your way out of something. It's about kind of understanding, what are the steps to take, kind of what is the cognitive process, what is the strategy, what information do I need, kind of like the way. I often talk about the will and the way and the want. So what is the kind of the process to get yourself from point A to point B? The next is kind of this idea about what is the underlying emotions, my motivation, my emotion regulation. How can I kind of navigate my way through this situation emotionally? What resources do I need to enable me to do that? You can
Mm-hmm.
have the way laid out, but you need the sort of the will. Or
Yeah.
sometimes you've got all the will and motivation in the will, but you don't actually know the strategy. And the other is then what we call want or habits or kind of automated behaviors. These are kind of habits that we may have performed so many times over. We've stored them as kind of an automated kind of rollout in terms of a behavioral program or a
Mm.
thinking program.
Mm.
And it's really hard to unroll them, but typically they emerge because of a particular situation or cue, and to kind of reflect and sort of think about, oh, well, I always have that thought or I perform that behavior in response to this particular cue or situation, and kind of be very analytical about it
Mm.
and go, oh, well, whenever I approach a situation where there's a room full of people I've never been before, I kind of start thinking about that time at school when everyone laughed at me and
Mm.
then go, oh, that's a habitual thought. So what could I start thinking about in a particular situation like this that would be more useful for me? Is this going to help me or hinder me? And It's not
Yeah.
inevitable that you have that thought.
Thought,
You
yeah.
could then perhaps rehearse a different kind of thought or strategy, going, these people are really interested to meet someone new and will help support me through this new endeavor. I mean, there's so many ways around that. That sort of thinking style is a very different one from recovering from like a physical trauma or something like that. So I think we need to be, as a neuroscientist, much more careful and thoughtful again about the words we're using, and so we can operationalize it, do the talk about the neurobiology in the right way too.
So does that also mean that because they say that loneliness has really, really intense impact on the health of the brain as much as smoking like 15 cigarettes a day? So does that mean that uh, socially, when we are engaged with people who we love, who we like to engage with, that also has an impact in a good way?
Yeah, 100%. Like we know we're social tribal animals. So, from the moment we're born, we
Mm.
require other people to help us, manage our physiology and to keep us warm and fed and dry and alive. So, we're born very, very helpless. So that kind of need to connect and belong and be looked after and be nurtured is there from birth. And when
Sure.
you go through pregnancy and motherhood, your brain shapes and alters to be able to provide that. Ideally, most women will do that with the right kind of help and support and structure around them. Um, and that never really kinds of it changes across the lifespan, that kind of need to belong and to feel accepted. For some people, though, that comes more naturally than others. Some people like being alone, and being kind of solitary or alone is very different from being lonely. Lonely is very much the perceived emotion of not belonging and feeling excluded, but you can be alone and be quite happy and fine about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that when people are lonely, mental health spirals because you start to kind of think that there's something wrong with you and you want to belong, but the feeling of exclusion leads to kind of poorer mental health, which can lead to poorer physical health because you're not sleeping, you're not exercising. It's very kind of easy to see how that spiral happens.
Mm-hmm.
Some people need to be taught the skills of how to connect and belong and create friends and kind of identify situations where they're regularly bumping into other people and with some kind of shared collective purpose. So some people that naturally comes about for them. Other people need kind of a few strategies and need to be taught how to connect and how to build friendships and how to have conversations with people and how to interact with people. And we
Mm-hmm.
do have lots of people who spend so much time looking at a device
Yeah.
that they haven't actually learned how to interact and read social cues from other people,
True.
and they think small talk's unimportant or whatever. That small talk's just a way of starting a conversation with a stranger.
Yeah.
It's just a way of connecting and
Yeah. Just
um yeah,
breaking the
yeah,
ice. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
And Sarah, we live in the times of artificial intelligence, so intelligence has become very easy. So in this world, how do you think AI can actually help the brain positively or has a negative impact? So how do you see AI playing a part in the journey forward?
Well, I don't really think at the moment. I'm not really thinking about it in terms of how does my AI impact my brain, like this, like sort of thing about me and myself. It's
Hmm.
more about how AI and machine learning is being used to analyze data, and drive neuroscience research forward. I think that that's what's far more interesting because we've now got like these global consortiums and biobanks and data sharing, and we've got these enormous data sets. I mean, there used to be a time when a research would have kind of like 17 research subjects and they would come into the lab and they might do some kind of MRI scanning on their brain, and the data would analyze the data using Excel or something. And now we might have 100,000 people's brains and the
Mm-hmm.
data in some kind of global, open access bank. And we can use AI to analyze that data in ways that we couldn't do very quickly or easily before. And now it's much, much kind of quicker and easier. And that's driving neuroscience forward and lots of research forward at quite a rapid pace. So that, it's giving us answers to questions that once upon a time used to take quite a long time. So I
Yeah.
think that that's kind of interesting. I suppose in terms of as an individual, is it going to change an individual brain? Is it going to shape how brains change and evolve? I mean, it's only going to do change the evolution of brains if it's somehow intervening with reproductive success.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to change individual brains in terms of how they learn, I suppose, the ability to outsource a lot of critical thinking. That's easy because who wants to do something that's hard? The friction is kind of lost in that
Mm-hmm.
space. But I think, universities and educational institutions and schools are sort of starting to think like the technology is here. How can we be more critical about how it's being used and done? You can still handwrite exams. You can
Mm-hmm.
still make someone come along and do a handwritten exam or a handwritten essay in front of you without, you know, that digital support around. So
Yeah.
I think it's just about working with it, not
Mhm.
just simply fighting against it. But
Sure.
I mean, I'm not an expert on AI. I don't really haven't really
No,
got
it's
with that
very
many.
new, but it's just
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I totally second on that, that the amount of data and the things which we can do the research on, and it provides so much of quick solutions to a lot of the information we didn't even know existed. So I think that's something amazing, and especially in the field of science and medicines and technology, I think it's going to be groundbreaking. So that's definitely a boon we live into. But Zara, I want to particularly ask you something where I have lifelong thought, or I believed in a myth that only 10% of the brains is something what we use. So I want to ask, is that according to you the truth? Or if yes, then
Yeah.
why do you think that persists? Because and do you really, how do you see that, the most urgent question, if somebody has to improve from 10% to 11%, is it possible to actually
I
improve?
mean, I'm not. I don't even know where that percentage thing came from, and I haven't heard that in quite a while. Maybe it's something to do with someone once said, we've all got a lot more potential than what we believe. I don't. I don't. I can't resolve that 10% idea with what I understand about the brain, so just put it in the bin.
Okay.
It's. I mean, and our brains are constantly changing and shaping and evolving and growing and dealing with a whole lot of information from our body and from the outside world and trying to make meaning of that with our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not as if 90% of that is unused.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of an outdated myth that doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of our current understanding. It's like saying we're only using 10% of the internet, or we're only,
Yeah.
I don't, it's kind of, what does that even mean? Yeah.
Okay. So something then, that leads me to something very, very fun question when I was doing the research, and I thought I should definitely ask. It was in 1954 when Albert Einstein passed. His brain was, retained for the studies purposes. And so speaking of that, because he always said that I'm not a genius, I'm just passionately curious. But from your perspective, what makes, or what truly makes a brain brilliant? And is there something which you're born with, or something you developed with curiosity? Because there is a neuroplasticity. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's always going to be a bit of both. It gets back to that age-old nature nurture kind of question. I was looking at that in my PhD, how much is biology and genes and how much is experience? And it's always both, and both, it's hard to untangle them. Um, I mean, biologically, you gain genes from each of your parents, and so that's underpinning everything. But then we need this kind of the rich experiences of life to kind of wire that brain up.
Mm-hmm.
Some people may have more innate curiosity than others. Some people, may have I don't like to use the words higher IQ, but I mean, we've got standard deviation curves, right? Some people are at one end and some people are at the other, and most of us are just hanging out in the middle there. Um, I mean, I think the idea of brilliance is not something I even really kind of think about. I perhaps would tend more towards that Einstein quote that we've all got capabilities and we've all got things that we are interested in exploring and
Mm-hmm.
ways in which we can improve. The idea of a brilliant brain isn't something I've given much thought to from a neuroscience perspective, to be perfectly honest. I find that question quite hard to answer.
Fair enough. So last but not least, I want to ask that If there is a non-negotiable 5 minutes daily habit which can have an immediate boost of focus, memory, or which is healthy for the brain, what do you think is that 5 minutes should, I mean, 5 minutes routine should look like? Because which can also be helpful for depression or your brain activity or brain's health.
5 minutes isn't long. I mean, if you could do 5 minutes of really hard exercise, that would probably be, high
Mm-hmm.
intensity training for 5 minutes. If you were limited to 5 minutes, you could drink a cup of coffee in 5 minutes. Maybe find a way to sort of reduce stress
Mm-hmm.
in 5 minutes. There's lots of ways to climb that mountain. I mean, sleep, ideally, you want more than 5 minutes of that. So, I mean, I think sleep and exercise are the kind of the foundations on which to build, and exercise is the thing that you can do in the 5 minutes. So I would
Sure.
probably have to go for that and include a cup of coffee in it because coffee's really good for you.
Really? Oh my God,
Mhm.
I love coffee. And any food, anything apart from coffee you would recommend? Some
Well, we
food.
know what food, you just don't eat crap. I mean, there's not one particular food. It's like about a dietary pattern across a lifetime. So a
Okay,
Mediterranean style diet.
okay. And last but not least, Sarah, if you were to give one piece of advice to all the women who are listening today, who are going through various stages of their lives, they don't know what their brain is doing to them, but they are suffering or they are having fun, what would you advise them?
Um, well, first of all, female brains aren't inherently broken because we're told from like puberty, the female brain is, this hysterical, mysterious, broken thing that, by default it's dysfunctional, and I just don't think that that's the case. Read my book and you'll find out why not. Um, and I think just like honestly, like you can't go past like sleep and exercise and good nutrition. It's so boring, but the basics haven't changed. Um, that's probably it. Social connection.
Yeah,
It's so trite. There's nothing magical
true.
out there. We're biological beings on this planet, the same as the wildlife out there. I think we just think we're something special. We're not.
Yeah, and I think also as women, we don't need to be sorry if we are on periods, if we are having mood swings, if there are some other things, there's so much going on in our
Yeah, men
body.
have just as many mood swings as women. I mean,
Do they? For the
they have
hormone?
as many, and as yeah, we've got empirical data on that. I mean, who's sitting behind you at the traffic lights, tooting at you in a car? Who's causing the wars? Who's responsible for the vast majority of domestic violence? Where is the emotional instability?
Hmm. Yeah,
It's
very,
not women.
no, absolutely
We've
not.
just been primed to believe it's us.
Yes, we've been fed that way, isn't it? That,
Yeah,
no,
so that's not true.
that's not true. Yeah, the evidence is
Let's just, yeah, I mean,
true.
you know,
Cool. And last but before I let you go, Sarah, I'm just going to ask some rapid fire questions very quickly, whatever comes to your mind. What's the best piece of advice you ever received?
um, salt water cures all, whether it's sweat, tears, or the sea.
Love that. What's the single biggest myth about human brain, something you believed early in your career, but now you think it was a complete trash?
I don't think I've ever believed myths because I've always been an academic neuroscientist, but I think outside of my beliefs is probably the idea that the female brain is, by its very nature, moody and dysfunctional and broken.
Okay. From the neuroscience perspective, what is that one activity parents should do to support the optimum brain development or in the children from the 0 to 5 years of age?
Read books to them.
Do they really help in terms of developing their brain?
Yeah, read books to your child, 100%.
Okay. What is your favorite book of all time which you recommend everyone should read, apart from your three books?
I read a lot of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just reread A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. I love that book.
Mm-hmm.
That's my favorite fiction book.
Okay, fair. Looking back at your career, Sarah, for 3 decades, what is that one habit or one unique characteristic or mindset you have, which you think was one of the contributions to your success, which was prime?
Definitely a love of learning. Like I still read a new neuroscience research paper or whatever and go, wow, that's really cool and interesting. And that was my very first thought about neuroscience when
Mm-hmm.
I first learned about synapses as an undergraduate. And I still have that same, like, wow, that's so cool feeling now. So it's just really that love of learning and that kind of continual curiosity.
And speaking of curiosity, what is that one thing which you are super excited about, which is getting researched at the moment in neuroscience?
I think definitely the longitudinal studies just sounds so boring. I think we're, waiting for them to mature. I wish we could sort of speed up time. A longitudinal study follows a large cohort of people kind of across a phase of life, whether it be through puberty or across pregnancy or across menopause or from midlife through to old age. And that's gives us far more information than a cohort study, which is like a snapshot of people at a certain point of time and kind of averaging all of those people's data. So waiting for these like kind of large longitudinal cohort studies to mature, I think is going to be really exciting but we can't speed up time. It's very nerdy.
I love that. What is that one piece of, I mean, what is that something you would tell if you meet 16 years old Sarah today? What is that one thing you'll tell her?
Um, I think just like that kind of rich varied, exciting, global life that you're dreaming of will come true. I was a quite happy 16-year-old. And I loved learning and I was really excited about where my life would lead. And yeah, I'd just say, it's going to be great. Like, enjoy the ride.
Yeah, world is your oyster. Absolutely.
Hmm.
What is that one hack or piece of advice you would give to improve the memory, where people usually tend to forget small things or sometimes big things? Is there any hack or anything you would recommend?
We have to protect your sleep. Sleep is your number one priority.
Okay, I'm gonna sleep tonight well. Do you believe in power of subconscious mind?
The power of the subconscious mind, I don't like that as a statement because I
Okay.
think it's trying to make more meaning of processes which are happening below our conscious awareness at any moment in time. Our brain is running our body and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of things that we're not aware of. And there's a lot of habits that we roll out that we don't think of that we can become more aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just our brain optimizing efficiency so we can react and respond to something new. I mean, I don't know, what a particular hormone level is or my gut pH is or my heart rate is, or, I'm not thinking about my posture consciously. There's a lot of things that our brain is doing below the level of our conscious attention at any moment in time. We're saying that that's your subconscious mind and it has some kind of power is not how I think about the brain and the body and the nervous system. Um, you can learn to tune in and out of, different aspects of your body and what your brain is doing and understanding. And I suppose for me, it's more about awareness and understanding, and knowing where you can intervene and how to go about that. That's the more powerful than the power of the subconscious mind. That's not language I tend to use.
Okay. And last but not least, if your life were a book, what would the title be?
Um, I'd like to think it would be something like a life well lived.
Hmm.
Um,
That's amazing.
Yeah, sweat tears in the salt water. I don't know. Yeah, a life well lived. I mean, I have a lovely time and I try to prioritize just um, doing lots of joyful things that connect me with other people and having good conversations and laughs and fun along the way. And, like anyone, there's inevitable things that happen that are
Hmm.
incredibly stressful and sad and difficult, and just trying to navigating through them and just giving myself grace.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I just try and have a really good time along the way. Find some time to have lots of laughs.
Amazing. On that note, Sarah, thank you so much for being on You Are a Force. Dr. Sarah McKay, you have been illuminating, and I cannot believe that I got an opportunity to do this with you because your story and your decades of work is so powerful and it is empowering generations of women to come even in the future as well. And currently, there's so much going on with the world and all this chaos, but your work actually grounds us. So I really,
Oh,
really
that's
want
nice.
to thank you for the work you do and the impact you have on our lives. And I would like to say to everyone who is listening today, remember this is not a podcast, this is a global sisterhood, and this is my coffee date with everybody. So just like Sarah, remember that you are a force too. You are not too old, you're not too late, your intellect is not limited. So keep that curiosity, go chase your dreams. Even, when people are writing off your journey, your beliefs, and your future, you can hold your pen and you can rewrite your story at any point in time. So until next time, stay brilliant, stay powerful, and don't forget to sleep tonight well.
All right, thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to You Are a Force. Hit subscribe and join us next week for more powerful stories from women rewriting the rules. Until then, keep building, keep leading, and remember, you are a force.